Hi, everyone. Today, I would like to talk to you about Chapter 2 in your practical research textbook. The second chapter of this textbook talks about really the heart of the research process. And the heart of any research process is understanding what the problem is that needs to be investigated. And if you don't have a good grasp on that, it is really hard to align everything that needs to be done in an effective research study. So this is really the key, and again, the heart of any research process. So with that being said, I want to talk about two types of research. There are two types of research out there. The first is basic research. And basic research, what that is it's enhancing our general knowledge about a particular topic. Okay. So it is increasing, it's advancing our kind of theoretical concepts or conceptualizations. And that could be about our physical world, it could be about our biological, social, or psychological world. Then there's applied research. Applied research actually is research that has an immediate relevance to current policies, current practices, current procedures. And really, it does inform human decision making about practical problems. This could be like evidence-based treatments, right? So, for those of you getting into behavioral health and you're going to have clients, this is a perfect example of taking research and applying it, right, to mitigate, um, let's say you're talking about burnout, right? I can read basic research on burnout, but it's another thing to read research and uncover maybe ways we can mitigate that in practice with a client. So that is applied research. Now, the line between the two is actually very, very thin, and it can be very blurry. It's sometimes hard to kind of decipher what's what. And the reason that is, and that's okay, but the reason that is because basic research a lot of times not only is enhancing our general knowledge, but at the same time it's answering questions that could be immediately applied with applied research, right? So I just want to talk through those two types. With that being said, when you're trying to uncover the problem, some problems just aren't suitable for research. And the reason that is because we can't actually interpret the data meaningfully. And so when I say that, I'm basically telling you that research is something that when we say that what's the problem, we're really looking at the gap in the literature. Okay. So the problem space. You read a bunch of articles on a topic of interest or concern. And then within that, you're trying to find where you can come in and truly add meaningful data or meaningful knowledge to what's already out there. You're trying to advance knowledge. And if you can't actually take data and interpret it in a meaningful way, it's likely not a problem that you should research. So there are four situations to avoid when considering a problem for the research process. The first one is that a research process shouldn't be just self-enlightenment, right? And achieving that for yourself. It really should help a broader population. Again, it needs to advance knowledge in that area. A project whose sole purpose is to compare two sets of data, right? That is not probably a suitable research project or research study. Anyone can go and take a data set from here and a data set from here and compare the two, but what does that actually mean? And what can we continue to build upon? The third one is just simply calculating a correlation coefficient. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we get into quantitative research methods later on in the semester. But just calculating a correlation coefficient to see if there's a relationship or how strong that association is between two related sets of data, that's not necessarily adding to the existing body or advancing knowledge in that area. And then finally, a problem that results in yes or no, right? That's an easy one. We don't want to just have a yes or no. We want to continue to find, additional areas of study and other, recommendations for future research, because again, researchers want to advance knowledge in these areas. So, how do we find the problem? Good research actually begins with identifying a good question to ask, and that is really important to know. And so, how do we do that? How do we choose an appropriate question? How do we choose an appropriate problem? I would say the first thing is look around you, because there are small problems that are suitable for research everywhere you look. Okay, so look around you, read existing literature about the topic. So find out what things are already known about a topic. If you want to study burnout, read about the burnout literature, read what's existing out there. Burnout started in the 70s. I'll use that as an example a little bit throughout this, so hopefully can provide some additional context, but read the existing literature about the topic that you're interested in. Find out what is known about it. And what we know about it is what the researchers are continuing to find out as each study comes out on that topic. The other thing to know about reading the existing literature about a topic is that researchers will also address what is still not known. So I believe I mentioned it in my first video, but as you start reading and getting very familiar with some of these scholarly journal articles and research studies that have been published, you'll see toward the end that there are sections for suggestions for future research, right? Or maybe even limitations of the current study so that you could probably identify maybe the next step, right? Maybe the next step in that research on that topic. And oftentimes that's a really great place to find that question. The third thing is seeking the advice of experts. And I say this because there are professors out there, right, that have specialized. There are researchers, there are other scholars out there that actually are probably pretty happy and flattered that you would ask them to talk to you about some of that stuff. So seek the advice of experts. When it comes to researchers, a lot of the researchers that are out there that are publishing journal articles, they are advancing knowledge in their particular subject matter expertise. So for example, DC and Ryan are known in motivation research. They have self-determination theory, and you will see their name pop up over and over and over again when it comes to reading on motivation, right? Or self-determination. So looking for those names, reaching out to professors, reaching out to those other scholars, they could help. And another thing you could do is you can start networking by attending professional conferences. So attending conferences, looking at conference programs where you find the sessions of interest in your discipline, ask questions in that. I will say that the APA website is fantastic. You can become a member of APA, and then you can actually choose to subscribe to the discipline of your choice. So for example, I'm a performance psychologist, and so I definitely subscribe to, the women's journal, but also I did that for sports and performance, right? So I did become a member of that division and I get access to some of those articles. So that's an option. You can explore the different divisions within APA and read those journal articles. Some are published monthly, some are published quarterly, some biannually, some annually. Just depends. The other thing that you want to do is you want to choose a topic that intrigues you. Research takes such a long time, right? From beginning to end, it could take a year, it could take a couple of years. And so if you're going to be spending and investing that much of your time and energy and effort into something, you want to choose a topic that you're passionate about, something that you're really interested in. I will also say you have to be careful because if you're too overly passionate about a topic, I would say that you have to be very aware of any biases that you might have going into that and really just kind of check yourself and make sure that everything is done, unbiased, right? It should be unbiased. It should be impartial. Choose a topic that other individuals find interesting and worthy of attention. So if you are going to be, wanting to teach at a university after, you graduate, maybe your research study is in the field of higher education or in elementary education. These are all things when you go and you publish, if you're working on a capstone project or if it's a thesis or a dissertation, as you continue on in your journey of academia, you may want to really focus your project or your efforts in the area that you want to go into because future employers are looking for that. They want to know that they're hiring somebody that is an expert in that area. So share your knowledge with others. And then finally, be realistic about what you can accomplish. It should be something that's manageable. it shouldn't be really extremely daunting. So if it feels that way, maybe that's not the best place to kind of dive into. So when you have identified the problem, you've identified the question that you want to ask, you have to write a purpose statement, right? And a purpose statement, want to give you some tips and tricks on this because this is very important. And this is something that I will be looking for in your papers this semester. So a purpose statement is very carefully phrased and it represents one or more goals of the total research effort. It's usually one sentence. I recommend putting it, especially as you're getting used to now writing with an academic tone. I recommend putting that purpose statement, honestly, at the end of your introduction. But what does a purpose statement do? It describes the problem or question very clearly and completely. Everyone wants to understand what it is you're trying to accomplish, what it is you're trying to investigate. So having that purpose statement and having it be very clear will help the readers. We know what we're going to get into, right? We know what it is you're looking at. You want to say precisely what you mean, right? Others can't read your mind. I don't want to have to guess. I don't think anyone wants to have to guess what it is you're trying to say, what it is you're trying to study. It should just be very clear. Oftentimes, I've heard students tell me that they feel like when they're writing academic papers, that they're repeating themselves kind of over and over again. And that is very true. And I will say that's probably true because anybody should be able to pick up any chapter of a paper or any paragraph of a paper and not read through it from start to finish, like I talked about in the last video, but skip around and still know what's happening. Okay, still know what's happening. Think through the feasibility of the project that your purpose statement implies. Think about all the implications. Is it something that's feasible? So for example, I want to study burnout and I want to do it with managers. Great. Do I have access to that population? Right? How am I going to collect the data? So you got to think through all of these items. Like I try to think of like my plan A and my plan B. How am I going to, recruit my sample? Do I have access to data? Am I going to be able to actually like write X, Y, and Z, right? What is the plan? And is it something that I can feasibly do? State the problem or question in a way that reflects an open mind about its solution. This is really important. Sometimes people confuse adding their hypothesis or what they think, what a researcher thinks will happen in the purpose statement, and a hypothesis should not be done in that at all. There's a methodology section. There's another paragraph for that or another section for that. You do not need to include a hypothesis. You should not ever in a problem statement. You want to keep an open mind, right? We don't know what's going to happen. And then edit your work, right? So improve your thinking, make sure you're thinking critically about it. Again, research, you'll have several iterations. And again, it's a cyclical process, right? We talked about this in the last video. So this is how you write a purpose statement. Now I want to take an example of one, and I want to show you a poorly written example and a properly written example. And I'm just going to use this burnout theme that I've been on. But a poorly written example could be, the purpose of this study is to prove the existing relationship between emotional intelligence and burnout in managers. So a couple things. I have the strike through and prove. I have the strike through and existing. We don't want to make assumptions. And one thing that I will say is we never prove anything as researchers. We never prove. We support, right? So the findings support this theory, or the findings support XYZ, but we don't want to use the word prove. A properly written one would be like this. The purpose of this quantitative correlational study is to examine if and to what extent a predictive relationship exists between emotional intelligence, emotional labor, and burnout in frontline managers across the southwestern region of the United States. Yes, it feels very wordy, but in that one sentence, I've done a lot. The first thing is I put and I highlighted the purpose, right? Again, at the end of that intro, right? The purpose of this is to do XYZ. I do include the methodology and the design in my purpose statement. It's a quantitative methodology, which means I'm looking at numbers. I'm going to run statistics, right? I'm going to do a data analysis after I collect the data, likely through surveys, okay, through a questionnaire, some kind of a validated instrument, and it's correlational. Okay, so a quantitative study, I mean, I could do an experiment, but I'm saying that I'm looking at a correlational design. I want to look at the relationship between different variables. Okay. Now, between emotional intelligence, emotional labor, and burnout, I'm listing my variables in there. The variables are the items that I'm going to be testing. And we'll have independent variables and we'll have dependent variables. We will go through that later. But in this case, and I'll high level it, an independent variable is one that is either observed, is either manipulated or controlled. So those are basically the cause. It's the cause. Think of cause and effect. That's your independent variable. Your dependent variable is the variable that we think is influenced by the independent variable. Okay. So in this purpose statement, my independent variables, I have two. It's emotional labor and emotional intelligence. And my dependent variable is burnout. I want to see if emotional intelligence and emotional labor can predict burnout. And I list my frontline managers. So I got more specific because managers can be anything. So I want to define it even more. I'm looking at frontline managers. And I'm also listing the geography, right? Like how vast, how broad am I going here? I'm just going to focus on the southwestern region of the United States. It might be 7 states, it might be 8 states, right? So that is a better written purpose statement than the first one. So I hope that that helps give context as you're kind of writing some of your papers throughout the course. Now, every research problem does need further delineation, okay? So you read the existing literature, you find out what is known about the topic, you find out what still needs to be uncovered, you find that problem space. The problem space, or that gap, you will actually begin to see, if you're really reading some of that existing literature, you will likely begin to see trends and themes of what still needs to be studied and what we still need to know about the topic. That is where your sweet spot is, okay? So once you've identified that and you've kind of come up with, this is my purpose statement, I'm thinking of doing a quantitative study, a quantitative methodology with XYZ design, I'm looking at the association between variables, you got to go a little bit further. You have to identify always a general theoretical or a conceptual framework. What is this based off of? So in the example that I just gave on emotional intelligence and burnout and emotional labor, there are 3 theoretical foundations in that. Each variable has their own theory. You have burnout theory, you have emotional intelligence, and you also have emotional labor, which is kind of tied to a couple things, right? Conservation of job demands and resources is one. So you kind of look at which theory you want to support and you want to identify it. If it's appropriate, you need to then state one or more a priori. It's called a priori hypotheses. Now, anytime you want to conduct a research study, you want to come up with what your hypothesis is. And I mentioned in the last video, it's almost like pre-registering your hypothesis. You want to state before you collect any data, before you collect or analyze any data, you want to state what you think. And there is a hypothesis and there's a null hypothesis. And we will talk about that later on in the course, not for this video, but you do want to state what will happen. So my research question might be, if I go back to this purpose statement and I want to align it, I've read all the literature on emotional intelligence, emotional labor, and burnout. I've identified that frontline managers, they're a vulnerable population, right? Lowest The lowest people in the hierarchy of leadership, oftentimes probably the most vulnerable to burnout. That's what I'm thinking, right? I've seen that in my experience being in HR for 20 years. So what I want to do now is I've done that. I've identified the 3 theories. So there's one instrument for emotional intelligence I'm going to give, one survey for that, one survey for emotional labor, one survey for burnout. Each one has its own theory that it's based off of. These instruments were created based off of theories. Okay. So I have that. The next thing that I want to do is I want to state my research question. So I might have 2 research questions. Okay. Or I might have 3. I might say, research question 1 is, does emotional intelligence predict burnout in frontline managers? Okay. My alternative hypothesis and my null hypothesis will be 2 different things. Okay. My alternative will be like, there is a relationship. My null will be like, there's no relationship. Okay. So I'm stating kind of both ways. Will it or will it not? My second research question might say, does emotional labor cause burnout or predict burnout in frontline managers? I might say, my alternative hypothesis might say, yep, there's a significant relationship there. And my null hypothesis will say, nope, there's not. It's null, no, right? None. And then my third research question could be, do emotional intelligence and emotional labor collectively together predict burnout in frontline managers? Okay, I might say my alternative hypothesis is, yep, there is a predictive relationship. There's a significant relationship there. And then my null is no, there's not. Okay, so that is really kind of how I want to ask that research question, how I want to state my hypotheses, and I want to do that before I actually collect data. Okay, so identify the general concepts and possible, the specific variables, right? We kind of talked about that a little bit. You want to define the terms. And so these things that I'm showing you here, these 1 through kind of 6, this is kind of how you write or what you want to include at the beginning of a proposal, right? So if you're ever going through and you're trying to produce your own research, this is kind of what you want to have in the front, right? This is how you want to make your proposal. You want to define the terms. So in the situation or the example, sorry, that I just talked to you about with burnout, emotional intelligence, and emotional labor, I might define the terms of what is a frontline manager. Because your definition of a frontline manager is very different from my definition of a frontline manager, right? What are we defining as burnout? How are we defining emotional intelligence? Is it emotional intelligence like ability emotional intelligence? Is it trait emotional intelligence? What is it? Same with emotional labor. What does that mean? So you want to be very clear on what all of this is. You want to state underlying assumptions. So assumptions are very important to list in any kind of research project or proposal, because you want to do that at the beginning. So for example, an assumption that you'll often hear about or see is, the researcher assumes, right, that all participants are voluntarily opting in to take this survey and that they're answering to the best of their ability and that they're being truthful, right, in their responses. That's an assumption I'm making. I am assuming that this is going to be happening. And then, if applicable, identify delimitations and limitations. So your limitations are going to be those things that are outside of your control, okay, as a researcher. Your delimitations are going to be the things that are within your control as a researcher, okay? So honestly, a limitation of your study could be that, hey, I'm giving this online survey. I can't control the environment that these participants are in. I don't know, right? That's outside of my control. But I want to list that up front. Delimitation could be that I'm keeping this to the southwestern region of the United States. I'm choosing to control how far wide we're going. Another one could be that I'm giving questionnaires. So this is self-reported data. So that could be, that I guess that could be a limitation or a delimitation. I would say it's within my control to give a self-report questionnaire versus like doing interviews and whatnot. It matches my design to do that. I would say that's my choice, right? That's a delimitation. So those are things that you also want to make sure that you're identifying. And if you start reading and getting familiar with some of the journals, articles out there and the resources and some of the papers, you'll see that like really solid ones, researchers will list that. They'll talk about that. Oftentimes that will be found in like the methodology and the design kind of section. So usually after the intro, after the like literature review and where they talk about the theory, before they actually analyze the data, then you have the methodology section. So it'll talk about what their method is, what their design is that they're using, how they recruited this sample, all of that. You will usually find something there on delimitations and limitations or assumptions. Now, I mentioned independent variables and I mentioned dependent variables a few slides ago, but variables a researcher studies as a possible cause of something, okay? These are independent variables. These can be observed variables, meaning I'm actually watching the participants. So for example, if I might be a researcher with my partner, we're sitting in a park and we are watching acts of aggression with 5-year-old kids. That is observable, okay? They could be measured. So measured meaning here's the self-report, here's the questionnaire or the instrument. Go ahead and on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being strongly disagree and 5 being strongly agree, how do you rate XYZ? That's measured. Manipulated are things that the researcher controls for. So that is often, you will find manipulation or manipulated variables are for experiments. Those are for experimental designs, okay? So you won't be manipulating a variable in just a simple correlational study. You won't. But in an experiment, you are, because you're controlling one of these variables. The dependent variables, the variables that are potentially caused or influenced by those independent variables. So in my case of the example that I'm giving, I want to see if emotional intelligence, the level of emotional intelligence somebody has, and the amount of emotional labor they display at work actually can cause people to reach burnout quicker. Does it? I don't know, right? So that is how I've listed burnout as my dependent variable. That's the outcome. Does it predict burnout? Okay. And then finally, the last 2 things that I want to share with you are just mediating variables and moderating variables. Not going to spend a ton of time on this, but it is in chapter 2. So I do want to go through this. But oftentimes you'll have an independent variable, you'll have a dependent variable, and you may have a 3rd variable in there or 4th variable, right? It just depends on what it is, what variables you're trying to test. A mediating variable is a variable that explains why the relationship exists between this variable and this variable, okay? So in the case of the burnout, I can tell you that, and actually let me get to moderating and then I'll tell you the example. But moderating variables actually are variables that explain how strong the relationship is between independent variables and dependent variables. You may also see this called, even as you're reading articles, an interaction effect. Is there an interaction? So in the example that I'm giving, right, on emotional labor, on emotional intelligence and burnout, if I wanted to do what's called a moderation, okay, I could change my research question. My research question could be, does emotional intelligence moderate the relationship, the predictive relationship between emotional labor and burnout? So what I could do is when I'm analyzing the data and I'm running the statistics on it, I can see at exactly what level those two variables, emotional labor and burnout, actually interact. So my hypothesis might be like, hey, if you have really high emotional intelligence, you may not get to burnout as quickly as people that have a low level of emotional intelligence. So that moderating variable tells you at each level of that variable how strong or weak that relationship is. Okay. Now, a mediating variable, I could do the same thing. I could say, does emotional intelligence actually explain why this relationship exists between emotional labor and burnout? So those are other variables you may hear a few times kind of throughout this course, but nevertheless, it is important to know. But when we look at mediating and moderating variables, that's not something that you're going to do in a qualitative research methodology. It is quantitative. So that is important to kind of uncover. We do have a chapter on quantitative research as well. So I believe that is it for today. I hope this was helpful. Let me know if you have any questions. I'm absolutely happy to help. And thank you for listening to chapter 2. Thanks, everyone. Bye.